By 1995, the entire future of a species came down to 5 cats hiding somewhere in a swamp, and nobody knew if they would ever be found again. The Florida panther was not just endangered, it was collapsing from the inside out. Fewer than 30 of them were left anywhere on Earth, and the ones that remained were being born broken. Kittens arrived with hearts that murmured audibly, tiny holes in the chambers that should never have been there. Males were born with undescended testicles, sometimes only one, sometimes none at all, and the sperm that did exist barely moved. A strange whorl fur along the spine, a defect nicknamed the cowlick, showed up in the overwhelming majority of the population, when healthy wildcat groups elsewhere almost never carried it. Their tails kinked at odd angles near the base, a visible signature of the species that had run out of new blood generations ago. By the early 1990s, biologists ran the numbers and got an answer nobody wanted to hear. A 95% chance the Florida panther would be extinct within 20 years. Not eventually, not someday, within 2 decades. To understand how it got that bad, you have to go back further, to a time when nobody was worried about genetics at all, because nobody believed there was anything left to save. The Florida panther had once ranged across the entire Southeast, through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, and South Carolina. Bounty hunters and ranchers treated them as vermin for over a century, and by the mid-20th century the animal had been erased from nearly every state it once called home. Florida didn't outlaw killing them until 1958, and by then most wildlife officials assumed the ban was symbolic, protecting a ghost. Through the 1960s, the state couldn't even confirm that a single breeding panther still existed anywhere within its borders. In 1972, the World Wildlife Fund hired a Texas houndsman and lifelong cougar tracker to answer that exact question. His name was Roy McBride, and he would go on to play the central role in this story twice, in 2 completely different capacities, 23 years apart. McBride spent months moving through the cypress domes and sawgrass prairies of South Florida, and within a year, he confirmed what almost nobody expected. Panthers were still out there, clustered in a shrinking pocket of habitat near Lake Okeechobee. But the population he found was minuscule, isolated, and already showing signs that something was deeply wrong with it. Through the early 1980s, Florida wildlife agencies began actively trapping the surviving panthers, drawing blood, administering vaccines, and fitting them with radio collars to track their movements. The veterinarian who led much of that fieldwork documented something far worse than simple population decline. She was seeing a slow-motion biological emergency, heart defects, reproductive failure, immune systems so weakened that infections a healthy cougar would shrug off were killing Florida panthers outright. She described the population as having hit a wall, a point where inbreeding had compounded across so many generations that nearly every kitten inherited flaws from both sides of its family tree at once, because there simply weren't enough separate family trees left. Genetic samples were sent to a researcher at the National Institutes of Health, and the lab results confirmed the field diagnosis in stark terms. The Florida panther carried less genetic variation than almost any large mammal population ever studied. Of the roughly 30 animals remaining, only about 6 females were producing offspring at all, and those offspring were dying young, arriving malformed, or turning out to be sterile. This wasn't a population in decline. It was a population running out of biological options. In October of 1992, scientists, federal officials, and state wildlife managers gathered at a conservation center in northern Florida to weigh an idea that had never been attempted at this scale before: genetic augmentation. The concept was straightforward to describe and enormously risky to attempt. Bring in female cougars from a genetically related population somewhere else, release them into Florida wild, and let them breed naturally with the surviving males. The resulting kittens would carry fresh genetic material that hadn't been recycled through decades of inbreeding, diluting the defects and, in theory, giving the bloodline a way out. The question was where those cougars should come from. The answer turned out to be Texas. Long before South Florida became geographically isolated, there had been natural gene flow between Florida panthers and the mountain lions of Texas. They weren't a foreign species being force-fit into a new ecosystem. They were distant cousins whose populations had simply drifted apart over a few centuries rather than being unrelated animals from opposite ends of the continent. Not everyone agreed this was a good idea. Conservation biologists worried that introducing outside genetics wouldn't rescue the Florida panther so much as erase it, replacing a distinct subspecies with a hybrid and calling it by the old name anyway. Nobody had ever attempted a genetic rescue on a wild, large carnivore population at this scale before. The closest comparisons involved smaller, far more controlled situations. Releasing outside cougars into the Everglades was a one-way experiment. Once it started, there was no calling it back if it went wrong. But the alternative was just as final. Do nothing and watch the species disappear within a generation, guaranteed. Money was its own obstacle. No government agency had budgeted for flying wild cougars across the country. So a private conservation group stepped in and covered the transportation cost itself. By January of 1995, every federal and state agency involved had signed off. It was time to find the cats. Roy McBride, now in his late 50s, was the one asked to do it because there was arguably no one else alive who could. He'd grown up in one of the most remote stretches of West Texas, country so isolated that a trip into town meant driving 100 miles. He had spent his entire life hunting mountain lions across that terrain, and a novelist had once used him as a source for a book about the borderlands. But there was a harder truth buried in McBride's resume. Earlier in his career, he had done more than almost anyone to push the mountain lion toward extinction in Texas, working as a hired hunter for ranchers and government bounty programs. Now, the same skills that once made him effective at killing cougars were being used to save a different population of them 600 miles away. Working with blindfolded pack mule to move quietly through canyon country, McBride flushed cougars out of caves and rock crevices where they denayed, and over the early months of 1995, he captured 8 adult females. They were crated, prepared for flight, and shipped to Florida. The first to arrive was a 4-year-old female, healthy and in her physical prime. She was placed in a holding enclosure, meant to spend roughly a week acclimating to the humidity and unfamiliar terrain of South Florida before her scheduled release. She didn't wait that long. The day after she arrived, handlers opened the enclosure to bring her water, and she was gone in seconds, bolting straight into the Everglades with no acclimation period, no formal release plan in motion yet, and no tracking team positioned to follow her. She survived out there for 3 years before she was found shot dead in 1998. Whoever killed her was never identified, and the reason was never established. Across the spring and summer of 1995, the rest of the Texas females were released into Everglades National Park, Big Cypress National Preserve, and the surrounding wildlands. By the end of that summer, all 8 were loose in South Florida. Not all of them got the chance to do what they'd been brought there for. One was killed by a vehicle on a highway. Another was shot under circumstances that were never fully explained, and she had been pregnant when she died. A third died under conditions state officials would later describe only as unclear. That left 5 Texas females, somewhere out in the swamp, expected to find and breed with Florida males who have been carrying generations of accumulated genetic damage. The entire fate of the subspecies now rested on whether those 5 animals could do what decades of inbreeding had made biologically impossible for the panthers already there. It worked faster than almost anyone predicted. Within a few years, biologists tracking the panther population started noticing something they hadn't seen in a long time. Kittens born without kink tails, without the cowlick defect, without audible heart murmurs. Males were being born with normally descended testicles. Over the following years, the 5 Texas females were documented producing at least 20 mixed ancestry kittens, and each of those went on to breed within the wider population, spreading the fresh genetic material further with every generation. The scientific measurements backed up what field biologists were seeing directly. Before the rescue, the Florida panther's genetic diversity, measured by a standard called heterozygosity, sat at around 16%. Within a decade of the Texas releases, that number had climbed to roughly 24%, close to a 50% increase in genetic variation across the population. Kitten survival rates told an even starker story. Between 2002 and 2004, only about 1 in 5 kittens from purely inbred Florida lineage survived. Kittens with Texas ancestry survived at more than double that rate. Heart defect prevalence in the mixed ancestry offspring dropped to roughly half of what had been in purebred panthers. By 2003, the last 2 Texas cougars still alive in the Florida population were removed from the wild. Their genetic contribution was already established in the next generation, and they were no longer needed to keep contributing directly. The recovery kept building in the years that followed. By 2007, biologists estimated the total population had crossed 100 individuals for the first time in modern record-keeping, more than triple what it had been at the start of the rescue. In 2010, a formal scientific analysis published in the journal Science confirmed the scale of the turnaround. Panther numbers up threefold since 1995. Genetic diversity roughly doubled. Survival and fitness measures improved across nearly every metric researchers tracked, and clear evidence that inbreeding-linked defects were declining across the population. Researchers outside the project called it one of the clearest demonstrations on record of what genetic rescue could accomplish for a wild population on the brink. Maybe the single clearest sign of how far the species had come arrived in 2017, when biologists tracked a female panther leading her kittens across the Caloosahatchee River. Moving north of boundary no panther with young had crossed in over 40 years. It wasn't just a population recovering in place. It was a population expanding again, reclaiming ground it had lost decades earlier. For a moment, it genuinely looked like the 95% extinction forecast from 1992 had been reversed outright. Then, in the summer of 2025, researchers from UCLA and UC Berkeley published a new genomic analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, sequencing dozens of modern Florida panthers and comparing them against historical samples. One of the oldest fears surrounding the 1995 rescue was that bringing in Texas genetics might eventually overwrite what made the Florida panther distinct in the first place, that the rescue would functionally end the subspecies by dilution. The new data answered that question directly. It hadn't happened. Modern Florida panthers still carry, on average, somewhere between roughly 60 and 80% of their original Florida ancestry. The Texas contribution diluted the inbreeding without erasing the lineage underneath it. But the same study surfaced a problem nobody had fully accounted for at the time. Both the 1995 Texas releases and an earlier, less remembered introduction of Central, American pumas back in the 1950s and 60s had brought in some harmful mutations along with the beneficial genetic diversity. Researchers now estimate that close to half of the harmful mutations circulating in the modern panther population trace back to those outside sources. For now, those mutations are staying hidden, masked, in genetic terms, by the overall diversity the rescue introduced, meaning they aren't currently expressing as physical defects. But the study's lead author cautioned that this protection isn't guaranteed to last. If the total population stays capped around 200 animals, inbreeding could gradually start climbing again, and those mass mutations could eventually begin expressing themselves the way the old defects once did. Her modeling suggests that a second genetic rescue may eventually be necessary, not because the first one failed, but because genetic rescue was never meant to be a permanent fix in the first place. It buys time, not a guarantee. And time is exactly what current panthers are running out of, though the threat now looks nothing like inbreeding. In 2024, Florida recorded 36 panther deaths, the highest single-year toll since 2016, and the leading cause by far was vehicle strikes. Within the first 4 months of 2025 alone, more panthers had already been killed on Florida roads. A proposed 10,000-home development plan within panther habitat is projected to generate enough additional traffic that, if built as designed, it alone could be enough to wipe out the population's recovery. A retired panther biologist who has tracked the species for 3 decades put the fear in plain terms. The worry isn't dramatic failure. It's quiet indifference. People simply deciding the story is over and moving on, saying we tried, while the roads finish what inbreeding almost did. The reach of what happened in the Everglades in 1995 extends well past South Florida. That project became a working template for genetic rescue efforts used on other small, isolated, inbreeding-threatened populations around the world since. It proved something conservation biologists had mostly only modeled on paper before, that a population standing at the very edge of extinction could, with the right intervention delivered at the right moment, recover real biological function, not just survive on paper, but regain fertility, heart health, and long-term viability. It proved that a handful of animals moved deliberately across the country and release into unfamiliar terrain could rewrite the trajectory of an entire subspecies within a single generation. But the harder lesson sitting underneath the success story is that genetic rescue was never a finish line. It bought the Florida Panther time, real, measurable, decades of time, but it didn't buy a guaranteed future. What comes next depends on habitat protection, traffic mitigation, possibly another deliberate introduction of outside genetics down the line, and a level of sustained political will that has to be carried forward by people who never met Roy McBride, never met the biologists who first documented the collapse, and in most cases will never see a wild Florida panther with their own eyes. The panthers living in South Florida today are the direct descendants of roughly 26 dying, deeply inbred cats and 5 Texas Cougars that did exactly what they were brought in to do. In the strictest genetic sense, they aren't pure the way the population once was, before anyone understood how much that purity was quietly killing them. There's something else now, a subspecies that had to be rescued from its own bloodline by an experiment most experts at the time genuinely believed would fail. Whether that rescue holds, or whether the population eventually slides back toward the edge it stood on in 1992, isn't going to be decided over the next 2 centuries. Based on everything the science is showing right now, it's going to be decided over the next 20 years.